Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ102, Introduction to Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's chapter is going to cover public policing and private security. So, we have a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and just jump right into our lecture. So, what we want to do, some things we want to learn, would be to look at the early development of the police in England, also the development of the police in early America, discuss the police profession and how it kind of came about, identify some of the main events in policing between 1960 and present, look at 4 levels of law enforcement in America, identify the most prominent federal law enforcement agencies, take a look at the differences between local, county, and state and federal agencies, discuss some of the differences between public and private policing, and then finally we'll wrap it up talking a little bit about technology. So again, we do have a lot to cover. So the evolution of policing has really been dramatic and even somewhat cyclical. Many years ago, during tribal times, the people at that time appointed villagers to protect them from outside marauders, thieves, robbers, etc., who wanted to basically destroy their life or their village. And then the government assumed responsibility for policing, and law enforcement became a public function. Now, in our current time and place, security professionals and civilian volunteers are also helping law enforcement, providing some of the function as government police. But does this represent a return to early policing, or would private policing just be more of kind of a helping hand, if you will? Well, let's kind of take a look at a little bit of history of law enforcement. So, the origin of U.S. police agencies, like that of criminal law, can be traced back to early English society. Okay? England had no regular police force before the Norman conquest, and every person living in the villages scattered throughout the countryside was basically responsible for aiding neighbors and protecting the settlement from thieves and marauders. Okay, so everyone kind of grouped their farms together around small, self-governing, self-policed villages, if you will. And when criminals were caught, they were punished. But understand, back in those days, the punishment was extremely severe. Now, over time, these informal groups became a little bit more structured. And here, they established that every male, unless excused, was to be enrolled in what they called a group of 10 families. And they called these 10 families tithings. Okay? And basically, these groups were entrusted with, kind of policing their own minor problems, such as dealing with, disturbances, fires, wild animals, or other threats. It was kind of a collective responsibility, if you will. And the leader of the tithing was called the tithing man. All right? And then, at that point also, when trouble occurred, the tithing man was expected to basically kind of make what they called a hue and cry. It's kind of like stop thief, but basically to cry out in order to assemble help and also warn the villagers. And those that heard the hue and cry were bound by that to help catch the individual. So kind of an interesting thing, right? So this kind of lower form of cooperation led to the foundation of what they called hundreds, or groups of 10 tithings. And the top official of the 100 was the 100 man, and basically to help lead them in pursuit of lawbreakers. Now, shortly after that, the 100 man was later called the parish constable. And it could be said that that constable was actually the first English police officer. So kind of an interesting dynamic, right? So finally, these hundreds, if you will, were consolidated into basically into shires, which resembled kind of the counties of today. And the head of these counties or these shires was called the shireve, a word that later became sheriff. And typically the sheriff's department, they police the counties, right? And so the sheriff, again, is the chief law enforcement officer of a county. So on the left, you have the Riverside County Sheriff, and on the right, you have the San Bernardino County Sheriff. So kind of an interesting way how all of this came about, and I find extremely interesting. So a couple of other definitions that you should probably know. In the 13th century, the watch system was created to help protect property in England's larger cities. So watchmen basically patrolled at night and helped protect against robberies, fires, and disturbances. And basically, again, so this was a kind of a 13th century system of law enforcement, if you will, that was 24 hours a day. The day shift was called the ward, and the night shift was called the watch. So that's where you kind of get the differences there. And then also at that time, you had, at about 1326, you had the Office of the Justice of the Peace that was created to assist the shireve, if you will, in controlling the county. And eventually these justices took on other judicial functions in addition to their role as a peacekeeper. And then just by definition, the constable basically is in early English towns, an appointed peacekeeper who organized citizens for protection and supervised the night watch. So by definition, an official appointed to act as the judicial officer in a county. That would be the definition of a constable. So what about private police? Okay, back then. So, we're still under that umbrella of the history, right? So as the 18th century began, rising crime rates in the cities encouraged a new form of, they call it private police, but also moneyed police. And I'll talk about that in a minute, who were basically able to profit both legally and criminally from the lack of a formal police department. And these private police agents, referred to as basically thief takers, if you will, were universally corrupt, taking profits not only from catching and informing on criminals, but also from theft, receiving stolen property, intimidation, perjury, and even blackmail. And they often relieved their prisoners of money and stolen goods and made more income by accepting, hush money, providing perjured evidence, swearing false oaths or statements, and operating, extortion rackets. So these thief takers, kind of a, we called the moneyed police, if you will. So Henry Fielding, the famed author of Tom Jones, along with Saunders Welch and, Sir John Fielding, Henry's brother, sought to clean up that thief-taking system at the time. Okay, so appointed by a city magistrate in 1748, Fielding operated his own group of moneyed police out of Bow Street in London, basically directing and employing them throughout the city and, in the area there, deciding which cases to investigate and what streets to protect. So, again, in 1748, Henry Fielding, he was a lawyer, he was a playwright, he was a novelist. He was appointed the chief magistrate of Bow Street when there really wasn't law enforcement in London, right? And he did at one point, he fought for social and criminal reform. He also defied the law by discharging, prisoners convicted of, smaller crimes, petty crimes, giving them reprimands basically instead of instead of a harsher penalty, even the death penalty. So he was actually exercising leniency. And Fielding was also very instrumental in establishing, again, the Bow Street Runners, which technically, if you look at it, would have been was the first detective unit in London. And here's kind of an old photograph of what they would wear back then. So not too long after that, we have the kind of establishment of the London Met Police. So in 1829, Sir Robert Peel, England's Home Secretary, guided through Parliament an act for improving the police in and near metropolis. And the legislation came to be known as the Metropolitan Police Act. And Peel was also among the first influential figures in policing history to call for more than just, a crime-fighting role for officers. He identified 9 different principles that he felt could characterize police forces. And on page 164 in your textbook up at the top, it actually lists those, or you can go to any search engine and you can type that in there and you can kind of take a look at it. Now, Peel's Metropolitan Police Act established the first organized police force in London, composed of more than 1,000 men. The London police force was structured along military lines. Okay, its members would be known from then on as Bobbies, after Robert Peel. Bobby Robert kind of makes sense, right? After their creator, or the person that made this up. And they did wear distinctive uniforms. They were led by 2 magistrates who were later given the title of commissioner. However, the ultimate responsibility for police fell to the Home Secretary and, consequently Parliament. Now, the early Bobbies at this time, they did suffer a lot of problems. Many of them were corrupt. They were unsuccessful at stopping crime, and they were also influenced by wealthy individuals. So, despite its recognized shortcomings, the London experiment here of this early agency proved to be a vast improvement over what had come before, and it was considered so successful that the Metropolitan Police soon began providing law enforcement assistance to, areas that actually requested it. So, again, when we talk about the London Met Police, we talk about Sir Robert Peel, the father. They call him the father of modern policing, and he did propose that return to, community responsibility for preserving law and order. And again, back in 1829, that London Metropolitan Police, the officers were called Bobbies, and sometimes they were called Peelers, but typically Bobbies after Sir Bobby Peel, Sir Robert Peel. Uniformed for easy identification, kind of a funny uniform though. They wore top hats, royal blue coats, and white trousers. And if you look at Sir Robert Peel's 9 principles of policing, you'll kind of understand why the top hat, etc. So interesting stuff. Okay, so as we start to kind of move forward again, law enforcement in colonial America, parallel the British model. So let's kind of take a look at how things started to kind of come about. So law enforcement in colonial America did parallel the British model. In colonies, the county sheriff became the most important law enforcement agent, right? And in addition to keeping the peace and fighting crime, the sheriff would collect taxes, supervise elections, and handled a great deal of other duties. So there were a lot of other duties. And, in the cities, law enforcement was the kind of province of the town marshal, who was aided often unwillingly by a variety of constables, night watchmen, police justices, and even city council members. So, kind of an interesting thing how the sheriff kind of came about. And then as we kind of start to move forward again, we have early policing in the U.S., right? Or a little more modern, if you will. So the modern police department was born out of the kind of urban mob violence that racked the nation's cities in the 19th century. All right. Boston created the first formal U.S. police department in 1833. New York formed its police department in 1844, and Philadelphia did so in 1854. Now, just so you know, there is a little bit of discrepancy depending upon who you talk to about early policing. Some people think New York was the first, others credit Boston, etc. But here we're going to kind of stick with this, okay? So the new police departments basically replaced the old night watch system and relegated constables and sheriffs to serving, court orders, running the jails, and things like that. At first, the urban police departments inherited the functions of institutions they replaced. For example, the Boston police, they were charged with maintaining public health until 1853. In New York, the police were responsible for street sweeping until 1881. And politics dominated the departments and determined the recruitment of new officers and the promotion of supervisors. An individual with the right connections could actually, be hired despite lack of qualifications. And we know that won't happen now. But early police agencies were a little bit corrupt, brutal, and extremely inefficient. So, in the late 19th century, though, police work was highly desirable because it paid more than other blue-collar jobs. And by 1880, the average factory worker earned about $450 per year, while a metropolitan police officer made double that amount. So, police work itself was primitive. Few of even the simplest technology innovations common today, such as call boxes or record keeping, or even backup officers, wasn't around back then. So again, we kind of talk about, just a little bit of these agencies individually. Boston, in 1631, the Boston court established a 6-man force to guard the city, etc. In 1702, the police were to patrol the streets in silence, but in 1735, they were required to call out the time of day. So that would be, 3 o'clock, all is well, letting people know that, hey, things are okay in the city. A little bit about New York. In 1643, they had what they call the Burgher Guard, established to protect that colony. In 1653, it changed to what they call a rattle watch group, who patrolled at night armed with rattles that would help them call for help. And in 1844, a paid day watch was established consisting of 16 officers. And while Boston had the first actual police department, it said that New York PD was the first modern round-the-clock paid American city police force. So again, a little bit of controversy there, and it's always fun to kind of talk about this stuff, right? And then in 1850, California became a state. 1853, the city council established a police force of 100 volunteers called the Los Angeles Rangers. In 1869, a paid police department was actually formed. So kind of back to the early 19th century again. So in Boston, we know that these early police agencies, right? Boston, New York, Philadelphia, they were political, they were primitive, little training, very, they had unlimited discretion, hardly any supervision. And honestly, they really weren't even trained. So a lot of issues back then, okay? And again, police work was kind of primitive. I'm not really sure what picture was supposed to be there, but police work was primitive, no technology. Even call boxes, were kind of unheard of, or, backup, etc. And police agencies, started to evolve slowly in the second half of the 19th century. And then you have some, kind of highlights. You have uniforms that came about in 1853 in New York. the telegraph in 1850s, linking precincts together. Then you had call boxes, okay, using a telegraph system that were around in 1867, then bicycles in 1897, and the first police car in 1910. So, boy, have we come a long way when it comes to law enforcement, right? You can look at the first police car compared to what law enforcement officers are driving now. So things are quite a bit different. Okay, so kind of, keeping with the history, let's look a little bit now at 20th century reform. So in an effort to reduce police corruption, civic leaders in a number of jurisdictions created administrative boards to lessen local officials' control over the police. And these boards were responsible for appointing police administrators and controlling police affairs. In many instances, these measures failed because the private citizens appointed to those review boards lacked any type of expertise in the intricacies of police work, right? They weren't police, so they didn't understand how the system worked, so they weren't even sure what to do. And another reform movement was the takeover of some big city police agencies by legislators because things just weren't kind of running the way that some of these large cities should have been run. Now, around the turn of the 20th century, a number of nationally recognized leaders called for measures to help improve and professionalize the police. In 1893, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, known as IACP, a professional society was formed, and under the direction of its first president, the IACP became the leading voice for police reform during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And the IACP called for creating a civil service police force and for removing political influence and control. It advocated for a centralized organizational structure and record keeping to curb basically the power of politically aligned precinct captains. And then still another professional reform the IACP helped foster would be the creation of specialized units, right? Such as delinquency control squads back then. And, kind of other things that emerged. In 1829, President Herbert Hoover created the National Commission on Law Observance and Enforcement, otherwise known as the Wickersham Commission. And it was based on, it was for George Wickersham, who was the chair of that commission. And it was formed to study the U.S. criminal justice system and to make recommendations for improvement. Now, in 1931, it issued the so-called Wickersham Commission Report. And 2 volumes of the report dealt specifically with police. Volume 2, called Lawlessness in Law Enforcement, portrayed the police in kind of a unfavorable light, calling them inefficient, sometimes racist, brutal, and even corrupt. And volume 14, called The Police, was authored mostly by August Vollmer, one of the most famous police reformers of all time, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute. And in this part of the report, he discussed methods that could be used to professionalize the police, several of which he had already used over his own law enforcement career. So, August Vollmer and O.W. Wilson should be credited for the real emergence of police professionalism. So while serving as the police chief in Berkeley, California, Vollmer instituted university training for young officers. He also developed the School of Criminology, at UC Berkeley. So, kind of a cool thing. And this actually became the model for justice-related programs around the United States. And one of Vollmer's proteges was O.W. Wilson, who pioneered the use of advanced training for officers to include modern management and administrative techniques. So, he really became the single most kind of influential individual on this type of subject at that particular time. So with that said, we're going to start to kind of walk through the different, decades, if you will, in policing. So, the modern era of policing can really be traced from the 60s to the present. And several major things happened, in these different decades in policing history. So in the 1960s, turmoil and crisis were the hallmarks of policing. Throughout this decade, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a number of decisions designed to control police operations and procedures. Police officers were now required to obey strict guidelines when questioning suspects, conducting searches, and when using any type of wiretaps. And as the civil rights of suspects were significantly expanded, police also complained that they were basically being handcuffed by the courts, if you will. Also during this time, civil unrest produced a growing tension between police and the public. And then compounding these problems really was a rapidly growing crime rate. The number of violent and property crimes increased dramatically. Drug addiction and abuse, common in all social classes, grew to be a national concern. And urban police departments could not really control the crime rate. And police officers basically kind of, resented the demands that were being placed on them by citizens who really weren't happy because they couldn't control some of the crime issues and some of the drug issues. So a lot of things happening in the 60s, right? And then let's kind of move to the 70s. So, the 1970s witnessed many structural changes to, in police agencies themselves. The end of the Vietnam War significantly reduced tension between students and police. However, relationships between police and minorities was a little bit rocky, or still rocky. And locals, basically local fears and distrust combined with conservative federal policies encouraged police departments to control what was perceived as an emerging minority group threat, if you will. So there was also increased federal government support for criminal justice that greatly influenced police operations. At that particular time also, quite a few more women and minorities were recruited to police work. Affirmative action programs basically helped alter, albeit too slow, the ethnic, racial, and gender composition of U.S. policing. So these are some of the things that happened also in the 1970s. And then also, I think I missed this, Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA, devoted a lot of its funding for training of officers. So, and also some research. So these are kind of some of the things that happened in the 70s. Now, in the 1980s, the 1980s began, or as the 1980s began, the police role seemed to be changing significantly. A number of experts acknowledged that the police were not simply crime fighters and called for police to develop a greater awareness of community issues, which resulted in the emergence of the community policing concept, something that we still use today. Police unions, which began to grow in the late 1960s, continued to have a great impact on departmental administration in the 1980s. And unions fought for and won increased salaries and benefits for their members. In many of these instances, unions basically eroded the power of the police chief to make unquestioned policy and personal decisions. Now, during this decade, chiefs of police commonly consulted with union leaders before making major decisions concerning department operations. So a lot of interesting things that kind of happened. Police, community relations, again, still a major problem. Riots and incidents of urban conflict occurred in some of the nation's largest cities. They triggered continual concern about the police role, what that should be, especially in some of the, inner city neighborhoods, if you will. And then when we move to the 1990s, so the 1990s really began on kind of a sour note, and it did end, though, with an air of, some optimism. So, the King case, the Rodney King case, prompted an era of reform. And just kind of a quick little tidbit, Rodney King actually lived in Rialto for quite a long time, and I knew him. Went to his house on several occasions for calls, and he was very polite with the Rialto Police Department, etc. But this is after, of course, all this LA stuff. But anyway, just kind of an interesting little tidbit. Anyway, the King case prompted an era of reform. Several police experts basically decreed that the nation's police forces should be evaluated not on their crime-fighting ability, but on their, courteousness, behavior, and helpfulness. And interest was renewed in reviving an earlier style of police work, featuring foot patrols and increased citizen contact. Okay, so, some different things. And police departments began to embrace new forms of policing that stress cooperation with the community and problem solving. And of course, this is referred to as the community policing model. So again, it kind of started off with the Rodney King incident on March 3rd, 1991. It did prompt a new era of reform, if you will. If you recall, King, who was driving, was drunk and under the influence of drugs. During the incident that occurred, that was a helicopter was able to take videotape of this. Police delivered 56 baton strikes and 6 kicks to Mr. King during a 2-minute period. And again, the incident was captured on video. And this incident, including the preceding trial of the officers, it prompted demonstrations in riots, etc. But it also prompted an era kind of reform. And here's a couple of photos of the incident and the aftermath. So again, this was the beginning of the community policing model. And you can see the definition there. And also kind of a better push for more diversity in law enforcement agencies. Okay, so there was this big ongoing effort to bring diversity into law enforcement agencies, and shortly after that, you started to see African Americans being hired as chiefs of police, particularly in Los Angeles, and as a result, and this is the better part, okay. As a result of some of those reform efforts, the intellectual caliber of law enforcement rose dramatically, and they became smarter, better informed, and more sophisticated than ever before. Management skills improved, and senior police managers basically began to implement, information technology systems. And as a result, policing became intellectually more demanding, requiring specialized knowledge about technology, forensic analysis, and crime, etc. Not just kind of a knuckle dragger, if you will, right? So that the reform did do some good for law enforcement. Okay, and then we're into the 2000s. Okay, so the events of September 11th, 2001 made basically an indelible mark on policing as we know it today. Federal agencies were reorganized in response to the terrorist attacks. State and local agencies shifted resources to terrorism prevention. Intelligence gathering became important, as did interagency cooperation, which quite frankly didn't have a lot at that time. joint anti-terrorism task forces began to pop up all around the country. And to this day, a wealth of law enforcement activity, especially in large urban areas, is devoted to the prevention of another 9/11. So a lot of different things kind of happening. And since 2000, policing, along with other components of the criminal justice system, have entered into what we call evidence-based policing. Yeah, there's increasing pressure to do more with less. So agencies are really striving to identify best practices that most capably control and prevent crime. So, a lot of different changes are kind of coming about. When the economy basically spiraled downward in 2008, the whole world economy was affected. The European sovereign debt crisis, the U.S. Based subprime mortgage crisis, high levels of household debt, trade imbalance, high unemployment, and other factors affected everyone, including law enforcement. So we kind of went through a tough time there, and tax revenues kind of slipped, and law enforcement agencies around the country were forced to make some difficult decisions. Many had hiring freezes, and others went so far as to lay off some officers, and some of the very small agencies actually closed up shop and ended up contracting with local sheriff's departments. So, by all accounts, the economy has made somewhat of a turn for the better. But we do understand that we are still in that evidence-based era where we're striving to do more with less. And then most recently, in light of events in Ferguson, Missouri and elsewhere, police have begun to basically, suffer something of a kind of a legitimacy crisis, if you will. And partly in response to this, at that time, then President Barack Obama assembled the Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and some of the information you can see in your textbook on page 172, and I have that's the cover of it, and I'll actually put a link in here where you can access the entire report. But on page 172, it talks about some of the members that were involved and some of the big, kind of things that were covered, like building trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, and officer wellness and safety. And a lot of recommendations were made out of that. So that's another thing that actually was good for law enforcement. Okay, so we're a little bit over the halfway point, and I'm trying to figure out whether I should continue on or go ahead and shut down. So I think what we'll do now is we'll stop now, we'll take our first break, and then we'll come back for part 2.